Yo guys, just wanted to say thank you so much for watching the video, and don't forget, let them cook. Just since we're meeting things, why don't you go ahead and admit something?
I will not vote for Kamala Harris and Donald Trump.
Why don't you just go ahead and admit to something?
I got really drunk one time with my friends when we went camping. I'm very drunk. We were all wearing like clown makeup, black and white. We're looking like mimes, and we see like this school trip also like going camping, and they have these very little tents, 3 tent pegs each. In the middle of the night, I just took one of the tent pegs as I walked past. I should just like collapse them.
Just since we're all sitting here admitting things.
I got molested in a ball pit when I was 5.
Just since we're admitting things, why don't you go ahead and admit that? Why don't you just go ahead and admit something?
Who am I to you? I'm a fucking raging alcoholic. I started drinking alcohol when I was about 12 years old. I've lived in Alabama for so fucking long that drinking is just a natural, like, effect of life. It is 100%. And, so, you know, you start drinking at a young age and shit. Oh, yeah, whole family of fucking drug addicts, dude. We're a whole fucking lot of dumbasses. Well, for a long time, I really didn't give a fuck, but now that I'm an adult, by 16 to 18, you know, I was experiencing, like, pretty advanced depression. Like, not shit. If I don't drink, I'll probably, like, kill myself. Miserable. Unbearable. Life is miserable without alcohol. I don't wish my life was different. I'm content with the despair of drinking.
Why don't you tell me something that just really hits home base for you? Why don't you tell me a story that makes you want to just binge eat ice cream and watch like fucking 20 episodes of an episode? Why don't you tell me a story of just fucking ultimate heartbreak and struggle that you've went through? Tell me a fucking story of devastation and hardships. And tell it in like in a dark, depressed, tell it like you're in like a really depressed voice. Talk like Batman. Tell me a story of just fucking horrible things that have happened. Tell me you got like a fucking grandmother dying of a malignant tumor that's only got like 3 months to live, and you fucking like accidentally beat them up one night and you feel like a piece of shit about it. Just tell me some horrible shit, man. Let's talk about your addiction.
I walked in on my grandma wearing a strap on, fucking my favorite pocket pussy.
Why don't you go ahead and admit to something right now?
Have any of you watched the film Surf's Up? When I was 12, that film gave me a piss kink for a year.
Why don't you go ahead and admit to something?
A lot of the stuff that goes in my head literally is now about pigeons.
Why don't you go ahead and admit to something right now?
I have nothing to admit.
Why don't you go ahead and admit to something?
Sometimes my boyfriend.
Why don't you go ahead and admit to something?
I broke my glasses.
Why don't you go ahead and admit to something right now?
I'm a huge New Jeans fan.
Why don't you go ahead and admit to something?
I really like touching 12-year-olds.
Why don't you go ahead and admit to something for me right now?
I'm black.
Why don't you go ahead and admit to something right now?
My ex, she was a great girlfriend, but she wanted me to go vegan, and I said I would. I did try, and I went on, and then I just couldn't lie anymore about going vegan because I didn't want to upset her. Well, it killed me, to be honest. I know it killed her, but I think it killed me. It pretty much tells me to kill myself every day, but I don't.
Go ahead and admit to something.
I aborted my child.
Why don't you go ahead and admit to something?
I was an alcoholic and I did drugs.
Why don't you just go ahead and admit to something?
I raped a little girl.
Why don't you go ahead and admit to something?
I mean, my ex-girlfriend was quite a bitch. You know, she's a pedophile now.
Why don't you go ahead and admit to something?
I force-fed my friend's dog.
Thank you for admitting.
Drugs.
Just since we're admitting things, of course, you know, I like to crush up graham crackers with my butthole and feed them to the local crows at the park. Well, I'm training them secretly, but I didn't want to let that out yet. I didn't want to admit that.
It's for admitting things.
I just want to let you guys know sometimes I jerk myself off to my right business shoe and not my tennis shoe because the business shoe is the one my hot secretary stepped on.
Why don't you just go ahead and admit to something?
I'm sorry? What? I'm just gonna go. Bye.
Why don't you go ahead and admit something?
I stayed with my ex knowing I shouldn't.
Why don't you just go ahead and admit something for me right now?
I had sex really early in life.
Just go ahead and admit to something.
I've been lying to one of my friends actually recently. I got sick and I haven't been going to the gym with him. And while I've been sick, I've been eating a lot of junk food. And today I'm I'm not really as sick, and I told him I couldn't go to the. I told him that I'm still eating good and I'll be ready to go to the gym. Then today I told him I got sick again, but really I didn't eat any good food, and I actually had Burger King. It makes me feel bad.
Why don't you just go ahead and admit to something for me right now?
I actually haven't finished Skibbity Toilet. I've only just watched the first couple episodes. Well, that one is a pretty good series.
Just since we're many things, what's going on here?
I used to work for a guy that used to have like multiple ties to multiple different mafia leaders. I used to clean his house.
Why don't you go ahead and admit to something for me right now, Chester?
That I did, unfortunately, do a hit and run on a young child a couple years ago.
Why don't you go ahead and admit to something right now?
It was in Africa, and there was a sort of a crisis with the farm, and then we didn't do anything that weren't under orders, I guess. But well, technically, someone did get buried in like a pit of sand, but only for a few seconds though. So
why don't you go ahead and admit to something?
On my shit that I would have to admit it's too dark. I'm a contractor. I have 17 kills under my belt. Some better than other. By like fourth one, I was happy about because I went into the dude's house afterwards. So the little base where he was staying was like one room and a abandoned apartment building, and there was like a decapitated woman just like there.
Why don't you just go ahead and admit to something right now?
I admit that I changed my avatar.
Why don't you go ahead and admit to something?
I like one of my friends, but I can't get rid of my feelings for him. But it's okay. The torture is fine.
Why don't you go ahead and admit to something?
I summoned items.
Why don't you go ahead and admit to something?
Yeah. I had to kill a guy at 16 because he was trying to kill me.
Yo guys, just wanted to say thank you so much for watching the video, and don't forget, let 'em cook.